This is the story of my Flaherty family who emigrated from Camist to St. Paul with assistance from James Hack-Tuke's Emigration Fund. What I know about them today involved the help of many kind people, family members, newly met cousins and friends, the dedicated folks at Karna Immigrants Commemorative Center, Uachtair Heritage Group, Minnesota Historical Society, Konamura Facebook genealogy groups, and authors writing on the important subjects of famine and emigration from Konamura. I'm deeply grateful for all the assistance I've received and the new friendships I've made along the way. Please note that what I know of my family story keeps evolving as I learn more information each year. My great-grandmother's name is Mary Elizabeth Flaherty Hartigan. She was born in 1870 in Upper Camus to William Flaherty and Anne Stewart. I don't know much about her life since she died before I was born, but I recall my mother telling me that she once asked her grandmother if she missed Ireland, to which Mary responded, "No, there was nothing there for me." I found it incredibly sad that as a young person, Mary did not see a future with possibilities. However, I'm not certain she didn't miss Ireland. Many years later, my mom told me about a song her father, Mary's son, used to sing called Galway Bay. That would have been the last place Mary saw before leaving Ireland forever at 13 years old. I've spent time looking for clues to what my family's life was like in Camus, as told from the perspective of their community. I've only found a few excerpts so far. For example, I was curious about the church they attended and found an article in the Gaelic Journal from 1897, 14 years after my family emigrated to Minnesota. It reads, "The dedication of the Camist Church in Konamura will take place on 15 August. This church has been erected in a very poor district in the wilds of Konamura by the untiring exertions of Father Joseph Cassidy, Rosmuck, Mamcross, County Galway, replacing the old thatched chapel, last of its kind in Ireland. The sermon will be preached in Irish by an accomplished Irish preacher, Reverend M.D. Conroy, as this is perhaps the first occasion in the century on which a dedication sermon has been preached in Irish. Those who love the national tongue should avail themselves of the opportunity to be present. We are sure that many of our readers will not fail to show their appreciation of the importance of this event by, if possible, participating in its celebration." After reading this, I wondered if my family heard the news, how they felt about their old church being replaced and not being able to attend this important event. Mary's father, William, was born around 1835, and I've not been able to confirm his parents or any siblings for him yet. He lists himself as a laborer and a small farmer on his children's birth records. But the only document I can find regarding land tenancy for William is one from 1875 stating that he rented a joint holding in Lower Camus. My great-great-grandmother, Anne Stewart, was born around 1842 and lived in Onegvan before marrying William. She had at least 3 brothers, Michael, Patrick, and Coleman. Coleman died young, but his wife and children emigrated to St. Paul, as did Patrick, Michael, and their families. Anne's parents were Bridget Flaherty of Garumna and Michael Stewart Sr. I learned from the Griffith valuation that Michael held a lease to harvest seaweed in nearby Inishlesk. From the same document, I also learned that he lived at J, and from the map feature, I was able to locate the exact location. There are only 2 mentions I can find in the records about Anne. Besides her children's birth and baptisms, she sponsored a baptism, and shortly after Anne and William were married in 1864, my young great-great-grandparents were accused of cutting and carrying away seaweed from someone else's plot along the shore in Rosmuck. Leaving home. On April 21, 1883, William, Anne, Mary, and 4 of her siblings, Dudley, Anne, Coleman, and Bridget, left Camist and boarded the SS Austrian at Galway Bay for Boston. Their oldest son, Martin, emigrated at a different time, and we haven't found the details of his departure yet. And as far as I know, 2 of their children did not emigrate, and I don't know what happened to them. Their final destination, as stated on the ship record, was St. Paul to become settlers, and they had a total of 2 bags between them. Was this everything they owned? If not, I wondered how they determined what to bring and what to leave behind. Their ocean journey lasted 12 days, arriving Boston on May 2nd, 1883. I have no firsthand accounts of my family's experience while on board the SS Austrian, and while much has been written regarding the deplorable conditions many experienced while on these ships, much less has been explored about the effects the transatlantic journeys had on immigrants. One study by Denise Rose Delgadio describes the process of emigration as a rite of passage, comprised of 3 stages: separation from Europe, liminality, the period on board the ship, and aggregation, the arrival in North America. Delgadio asserts that the liminal stage during the transatlantic voyage often served as a transitory period that bridged immigrants' lives between the old and new worlds. She further explains, in order to understand how the voyage acted as a liminal period, one must consider passengers' vulnerability and the conditions they endured, as well as the forces that pressured them to slowly shed elements of their native cultures. Immigrants were compelled to give up cultural belongings and forced to withstand oppressive physical conditions that diminished them and challenged their former identities. The journey also introduced immigrants to the multi-ethnic community that they would encounter in the US and promoted cooperation between these future fellow citizens. I have no way of knowing if my family felt pressure to shed their Irishness as they steamshipped further away from her shores, but it is possible. After my family arrived Boston, family lore says that my great-grandmother stayed in Boston at an Irish house for a bit, while others went ahead to St. Paul to get settled. According to a cousin, the story goes, Mary, who was 13 years old, cleaned offices at night. One evening, 2 businessmen in the building, while she was cleaning, started arguing. One man swore at the other, to which he responded, "Watch your language, there's a young girl here." The other man shouted, "She is just a stupid Irish girl who probably doesn't speak English." Well, Mary did speak English, and after hearing that insult, threw the hot, dirty bucket of water at the man and ran out of the building. Back at the Irish house, they told her she needed to leave immediately or risk being returned to Ireland. They hid her in a steamer trunk on a railroad going to St. Paul. 2 recipients were required to have a family member or close friend willing to house and assist them upon their arrival to the US. And the journey to their final destination was fully funded. If my family did split up in Boston, this may be unusual for 2 recipients, though the practice of heads of households securing work and a place to live before their family joined him was common amongst early US settlers. The records show only William and his oldest son Dudley living in St. Paul in 1883, staying at the same location, a temporary landing spot for new immigrants, and working as laborers. My family traveled on the British-owned Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, which was the major railroad in the province of Canada. They went from Boston to Montreal, then to Chicago, where they likely boarded the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad for the last leg of their long journey to St. Paul. On May 2nd, 1883, The St. Paul Daily Globe published an article shared by telegram from Montreal about Tuque-assisted immigrants. It reads in part, "A genuine specimen on an extensive scale of Irish destitution and poverty was witnessed here today by the arrival of 300 immigrants from Konamura County en route by the Grand Trunk to St. Paul, Minnesota, with the intention of settling in that state. They were accompanied by a young priest to whom they looked to for counsel and assistance, as they were all in an impecunious condition. Their appearance was indeed miserable in the extreme. Each were poorly clad for this climate, and a great many were without shoes. They were mostly in families and seemed careworn and emaciated, no doubt by the effects of hunger at home." The article goes on to say, "The party is an installment of those sent out by the Tuques Committee. It will take them considerable time to recuperate their wasted strength before they can go to work vigorously on lands." I have no doubt Tuque-assisted immigrants were weary and hungry upon their arrival. After living in poverty in Ireland and then undertaking an arduous journey to the US, who wouldn't be? Though my family, and I suspect many others, began vigorous work immediately after arriving in St. Paul, despite their condition. They were accustomed to surviving difficult conditions, and I suspect come from a long line of resilient people. A new life in Minnesota. Before discussing my family's lives in St. Paul, I must first acknowledge that the land they settled on and the land where I currently reside is and has been homeland to the Dakota people for over 12,000 years. Despite past government efforts to exterminate or diminish their presence, the Dakota people are still here. When William first arrived in St. Paul in 1883, he was a boarder at 158 Water Street and the St. Paul House. He worked as a laborer and a street sweeper for the St. Paul Public Works Department. His sons became laborers for the railroads, and his daughters worked as domestics and laundresses for hotels. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this happened, but it appears that shortly after William arrived, he purchased a residential lot for $500, equal to $14,000 today with inflation, in St. Paul's West Side Flats neighborhood along the Mississippi River. Then, on June 3rd, 1883, he applied for a permit to build a home. It would be a modest home, a 1.5-story wooden frame dwelling with a 1-story kitchen wing at the rear of the house and a wood shingle roof. Behind the house, there would be a shed and barn. A side porch on the south side of the kitchen wing exited toward the house on the corner. The cost to build the home was also $500. The garage was built first on the back half of the lot and used as temporary housing for the family. William and Anne rented the front half of the lot to help earn money for the construction of their new home. At some point, William sold his lot to George Adams for $500 plus interest, either to assist with financing, or if he had already paid for the lot in full, he may have mortgaged the lot to pay for the home construction. However it happened, construction on the home began sometime in 1884. By mid-August of 1886, William had the property paid in full, their home finished and paid for completely, and my great-great-grandparents held a deed of ownership in their hands. They were industrious new settlers. In the 1885 census, the entire family is living together at their new home on State Street, including boarders Mary and Martin Conroy. They settled with friends and families nearby, across the river in Conamura Patch, including the Stewarts, my great-great-grandmother's family, and others from Konamura who had participated in Bishop Ireland's graceful emigration scheme. The West Side Flats of St. Paul is lowland. prone to flooding from the Mississippi River. For a time, it was known as Konamura Row. Historically, the neighborhood has been the first home to poor new immigrants. They lived in tightly packed, small homes, and I imagine there was a fair amount of noise and pollution due to nearby industry. My family lived here until 1908, but their home remained intact until the clearance of the West Side Flats began after the 1952 flood. My family arrived St. Paul as it was experiencing significant expansion, just 25 years after Minnesota attained statehood. Rail lines were constructed across the city, and Minnesota became a major transportation gateway to the West. On September 3rd, 1883, St. Paul hosted an international celebration to mark the completion and grand opening of the Northern Pacific Railway, dubbed as Connecting St. Paul to China. Labor during this boom was in high demand, and immigrants moved into the city in record numbers. Between 1880 and 1890, the population of St. Paul exploded from 31,000 to 133,000 residents. My family would have crossed paths with people of many diverse cultures and languages, even while living in proximity to people who shared their nationality and faith. However, despite these economic opportunities, times were difficult for many, including my family. In St. Paul, wealth was delineated by elevation. The more you had, the higher you lived, away from the noise and pollution in the city. My family lived along the floodplain of the Mississippi River, about as low in elevation one can get on land. My great-great-grandfather was nearly 50 years old when he emigrated to the US, and he worked most of his life. Although he figured out a way to own a home early on, much to his credit, they got by on working class wages. And like most families, we had relatives who worked hard and some who struggled to find their way. I think the sting and stigma of poverty is persistent. Perhaps no one expressed this better than 9-year-old Billy Flaherty, who was sent to a reformatory for truancy in the early 20th century. At school, I wasn't happy. Why, you will probably ask. Because I was a child of the slums, unmannered, ill-bred, badly attired. This caused many of my classmates to dislike me and caused me to be repulsive to my teacher. It was through this that I became unhappy at school. Through it all, my family remained deeply religious after emigrating and attended St. Michael's Church. It's where Anna Williams' children were married as well. St. Michael's began in 1866 as a mission of the Cathedral of St. Paul and was first located in downtown. It moved across the Mississippi River to the West Side Flats to address the needs of Catholic Irish immigrants living there who could not afford the $1 toll to cross the Wabasha Street Bridge into downtown each Sunday for Mass. There's a story I recently learned about my great-grandmother Mary, telling her 5-year-old daughter Kate to give their priest a nickel for a prayer she wanted answered. Kate brought the nickel to the priest, but the priest told her he knew her family did not have much and told her to return the nickel to her mother, along with the assurance that her prayer would still be relayed. Kate did as she was told, but Mary was upset and worried that her prayer would not be answered without the nickel. She instructed Kate to go back to St. Michael's and insist that the priest take her nickel. Again, Kate did as she was told, and again, the priest told her he would not accept her nickel. Kate was stuck between the word of God and the will of her mother. In the end, it was her mother she feared most, and she hid the nickel on her way home. I'd give anything to know what Mary's prayer was for. St. Michael's Church recently closed due to low membership. Today, only the church bell tower remains in what is now a vibrant and predominantly Latin American neighborhood. In 1908, after all their children were married with their own families, William and Anne sold their home on State Street to a Jewish family who later converted it into a neighborhood grocery store. They bought a similar size home up the hill at 38 Atwater Street, built in 1889. Although their new location was still considered a lower income area for railroad workers, it would have been an upgraded neighborhood for them, out of the floodplain. The Atwater home stayed in the family until at least 1934. After the move, William continued to work as a laborer on the streets of St. Paul. Here's a little information about Anne and William's 6 children who emigrated to the US. Martin married Bridget Walsh and had 9 children. For many years, he lived on Fenton Street in the West Side Flats, not far from the family home on State Street. He was a laborer in the factory, and Bridget was a homemaker. Martin was also a proud member of the ancient order of the Hibernians, and his cape remains in their family. One of Martin's sons became a wagon driver. One was a butler, and a daughter was a laundress. Dudley was a laborer and active in St. Paul city government as a delegate for St. Paul, Ward 6, as a citizen Democrat in 1898. He first married Bridget O'Donnell and had 2 children, but Bridget died young not long after giving birth to their second son. Dudley then remarried Mary McDonough, and they had 3 children. The family story is that Mary came to the US unmarried from Ireland to work as an indentured servant for James J. Hill at his mansion on Summit Avenue. Sadly, Mary also died young, and Dudley and his 5 children moved in with Anna William. A descendant of Dudley shared this story. Our grandpa told us his mother died during childbirth, and his grandmother Anne raised him with his dad. She only spoke Irish, so he had to learn it, adding, "My grandpa Dudley Joseph Flaherty was a delivery driver. My dad, Dudley, was also a delivery driver, and then my brother Dudley worked for the City of St. Paul Water Department." Anne married Patrick Carter, and they had 8 children in St. Paul. Patrick was a blacksmith helper. I learned that a couple of Anna Williams' children were excellent baseball players on a team preceding the St. Paul Saints, and the entire family watched these games. Anne's granddaughter told me her uncles played baseball. She added, "They were very good athletes. One was a boxer in Chicago and made a lot of money, but he died young. Our uncles were very colorful characters." And my mother made sure her brothers were properly buried in the Catholic Church. She took care of everyone. She was a strong woman, as her parents had to be to take the risk of coming to the US. My grandfather was successful, but died at age 49. My grandmother Anne stayed in Boston for a few years, working as a milliner. I was 7 when she died, and she lived with us most of my early life. Coleman married Barbara Flaherty in Spokane, and they had 6 children. They moved to Washington around 1894 and San Francisco in 1900, presumably following railroad construction west for work. The family returned to St. Paul in 1905. While living on State Street next to his parents, Coleman was a laborer. One of their sons tragically drowned in the Mississippi River while chasing after a baseball when he was just 11 years old. One of their daughters worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad. After Coleman died, Barbara remarried Thomas McDonough in St. Paul. Bridget married John Ryan and had 1 son, Francis. They divorced soon after, and she remarried Francis Davies. They moved to Utah, had no children, and divorced shortly after. Bridget then moved to California to live with her son and his family, which is where she lived until she died. Mary, my great-grandmother, worked as a laundress until she married Michael Hartigan in 1896. They had 8 children in St. Paul. Michael was a blacksmith helper at the railroad engine shop, and Mary was a homemaker. At some point, they moved from the inner city of St. Paul to renting a home up the hill closer to Michael's work. They never owned their own home, and I learned that Mary never celebrated holidays in the commercial sense, perhaps due to their lack of money. Once, Michael surprised her with a real Christmas tree that he found. He put it up in the house against her wishes, and they decorated it with real fire candles. Unfortunately, the tree fell and burned the wall behind it. Mary took the tree outside, moved the couch against the burnt wall, and only said, "That is the last tree we will ever have in the house." Sometime during the 1930s, during the Depression, Mary moved to Chicago with 3 of her sons to find work. She died in Chicago in 1944 and was brought back to St. Paul to be buried next to her husband. Mary's grandson shared this story with me. I grew up in St. Paul and was the youngest of 11 children. Our street had a lot of Irish and Jewish lower middle class families. Everyone got along very well. 2 blocks south was the upper class area. A friend of mine who lived in the richer area was the son of the owner of a big construction company. Another's father was a federal judge who was involved in many big cases. But my friends spent a lot of time at my house because they thought it was like a circus, with so many people coming and going. It seemed like we always had a cousin or an uncle or an aunt staying with us. They just liked all the crazy stuff we did. And believe me, they could have made a movie about all the hijinks that went on there. We did not have a lot of money, but I did have a happy childhood for the most part. We were only about 6 blocks from the governor's mansion, a world apart in riches. But I guess we were rich in another way. We had family, a large, close-knit family. Of these 11 children, the 7 boys all served in the US military during wartime. Each served honorably. Sadly, 2 sons died, one after earning 3 Purple Hearts. William Flaherty died in St. Paul in 1926. He was 92 years old. His cause of death was listed as exposure and exhaustion, wandered away from home. Family lore says William was found leaning against a tree with his hands clinging to a rosary. And Stuart Flaherty died in 1923. She and William were married for 63 years. They are buried in the same plot with their daughter, Anne, and her husband, Patrick Carter. We have spent considerable time digging for the sunken grave markers of our Flaherty family members. We discovered Anne and William have no grave marker, and a family member is in the process of obtaining one for them. As I write this essay about my family, I can't help but wonder what my great-grandmother would think of it. Did I get it right? Have I missed the most important elements? Would she want me sharing it? I'll never know. But perhaps my ongoing inadequate attempt to remember her and her family's struggles is a symbol of the success of Tuke's immigration program. Today, I am in relative comfort because of their Herculean efforts, their deep well of strength and ability to survive. They were rich in the ways that matter most. And because they took a chance, said yes, We'd like to apply for emigration assistance. I am grateful. They left everything they knew for a foreign land, their family, landscape, language, and landmarks. I imagine their decision was based on what they knew at the time, that their prospects for a better future were grim. I believe Tuk's program gave them hope, a future with possibilities. Thank you.